To begin, I apologize for using a computer voice. I've tried just speaking into a mic. I find that I mumble, bumble and stumble too much. Even with a script. It's just not conducive to learning. Instead, I've used AWS Poly. It sounds a bit robotic, but believe me, it's much better than my speech. This video is for those of you that are 1 to 2 years into your guitar journey. You've found lots of great videos with great teachers. But you're probably feeling a bit frustrated because of all of the different patterns that it seems you have to memorize. I'll connect dots between many different musical patterns for guitar. Once you see these connections, you'll realize that there are just a few things to memorize and then all of these patterns fit together nicely. This video will be most helpful if you've seen these common topics and have some idea of their meaning. The whole step, half-step pattern of the major scale. The A major and A minor scales from the low E string 5th fret. What the 1, 4, 5 chords of a scale are. Notes on the E and A strings. The C, A, G, E, D, E minor, A minor and D minor open chords. E and A shape bar chords. The basic pentatonic shape. What relative major and minor means. I've discovered many connections that I haven't seen discussed in other videos. This is a lot of material. Too much to absorb in one viewing. So I've made chapters to divide the subjects. You're going to see that each scale has major 1, 4, 5 chords, a diminished chord, and the 1, 4, 5 relative minor chords. It's that simple. Did you know that just 2 chord shapes are used for the E, A, D, G, C and F chords? So finding the 1, 3, 5 notes and the most common chords comes down to just 2 different shapes. You'll also see that there is only one scale pattern for all of the modes. If you're still confused about modes, you'll see that it's probably the terminology. I'll review the caged system, and then show an easy trick to connect the pentatonic and full scale patterns to the caged chords. The pentatonic tricks chapter will tie everything together and you'll see how little needs to be memorized. Okay, let's begin connecting these dots. We need to define some terminology. We'll call the thin E string, string 1 and the thick E string, string 6. Notes and frets that are lower in tone will be called lower or below. And strings that are lower in tone will be called lower or below. Okay, on with the dots. Believe it or not, there is only one scale pattern. This pattern works for major or minor scales. In fact, it works for all modes. Let's start with the A minor scale since it's probably already familiar. Starting on the low E string, we'll call this a 2-1 spacing, starting at the root. On the next string we see another 2-1 spacing. And it's aligned to the first 2-1. The next higher string has a 2 spacing that is aligned to the bottom of the 2 2-1s. After a 2, we always have a 1-2, which is started lower by 1 fret. This is always followed by a second 1-2, which is aligned to the previous 1-2. In this case, we have to raise the 1-2 spacing because of the tuning between the G and B strings. Finally, the 2 1-2s are always followed by the first 2-1, aligned to the 1-2. We're going to see that this pattern is the same for all of the scales or modes. The pattern just rotates to fit different scales. So let's describe this basic pattern as 2-1, 2-1, 2, 1-2, 1-2. That's all we need. Let's test this pattern by examining the A major scale. Here it is, laid out around the 5th fret. I've listed the pattern rules so that we don't have to have them memorized yet. For A major the pattern starts with the 2 1-2s. Next we should have 2 2-1s that are aligned to the 1-2s. Check. Which should be followed by a 2. In this case, shifted because of the G to B tuning. Check. And then the first 1-2, shifted down 1 fret. Check. I'll show the A Dorian scale just as a final example. You don't need to know the Dorian scale. You can take my word for it. Here are the rules again. Let's see if it works. Yes, it's the same pattern. Just rotated. Let's step back and review. There is just one pattern for all scales. If we can memorize the 5 sequence pattern, then we'll see that it unlocks all scales. And, we'll find that it works all over the neck. We don't yet know how to rotate the pattern for any particular scale. But, if we get some of the pattern, the rest we can figure out. Let's use this pattern to find how the A minor scale lays out on the entire neck. First we'll move up to the 7th fret. Let's keep the notes from the 7th fret and get rid of the notes around the 5th fret. This makes the picture simpler. These must be the 2 1-2s, so we'll add those notes. The 2 1-2s are always followed by 2 2-1s, so we know where the next notes go. 2-2-1s are always followed by a 2, so we know where that note goes. Finally, the 2 is always followed by 2-1-2s, starting 1 fret lower. Let's move up the neck one more time, just for fun. Are you already starting to memorize the pattern? It's not that hard, is it? We'll get rid of the lower notes to make the picture simpler. Okay, these have to be the 2-1-2s. Which means that these have to be the 2-2-1s, but shifted because of the G to B tuning. Wrapping around the neck, we copy the high E string. That becomes the second 2-1. So, this next string has to be a 2. So, we see that the same pattern continues all over the neck, and we can use that to navigate up and down the neck. Okay, now let's apply this information to a couple scenarios. This first one might be a light bulb moment for many people. We're listening to a song and we want to try to improvise to it. We don't know the key or scale, so we just start noodling until a few notes sound right. I usually noodle until I find a 2-1 that seems to work. Now, we know that there is another 2-1 either below or above the string we're on. Try those strings. Once you find that, you know the entire pattern. Recall that the A minor scale began with the first 2-1, starting at the root. So, this song might be in the minor key of the root of your first 2-1. See if the minor chord of that root sounds right. Does the song resolve to that chord? If not, then the root might be the relative major, which we'll find right now. Recall that the A major scale began with the second note in the first 1-2. So, find the first 1-2 in your pattern, and play the major chord that goes with the second note. By the way, the relative major is always 3 frets higher than the minor, so we can just move up 3 frets. We'll cover these relative scales in more detail later. See if the song resolves better to that major chord. If so, then the song is in a major scale, and you now know the key and scale. Here's another light bulb moment that I got from Justin Sanderco. Again, we want to improvise to a song that we don't already know. Close your eyes and randomly place your finger anywhere on this fretboard. Now open your eyes. What you'll see is that you are never more than 1 fret away from a note in the key and scale. I'm showing the A minor scale, but all of the scales will look the same. Just rotate it a bit. So, if the note you're on doesn't seem to fit the song, you should just have to move up or down 1 fret. Let's review what we need to memorize. First, we define some terminology just to make descriptions unambiguous. Then, there is just one pattern for all of the modes. Major, minor, Dorian, etc. I don't think we need to memorize these next two about major and minor. Let's just make a mental note that the major and minor scales start in very specific spots in the 2-1 pattern. You'll naturally connect these dots over time. The next topic is an easy way to find the chords in any major or minor scale. I don't know why it took me so long to see this because it's really easy. We're going to rely on our knowledge of the blues 1-4-5 chord sequence. We all know this in minor and major. Here's the key piece of information about scales. For each of the 1-4-5 chords, there are corresponding relative chords. So, there will be a set of major 1-4-5 chords and the 3 corresponding relative minor chords in that same scale. And for the minor 1-4-5 chords of a minor scale, there are 3 corresponding relative major chords. Let's see this with an A major scale. The 1 chord is A major. The relative minor is 3 frets down. That's an F sharp minor. It's the 6th chord in the scale of A major. The 4 chord is the D major, and its relative minor, 3 frets down, is B minor, which is the 2 chord for the scale of A major. The 5 chord in the scale of A major is the E chord. The corresponding relative minor chord, 3 frets down, is the 3 chord in the scale of A major. The same trick works for minor scales. We have a set of minor 1-4-5 chords for the A minor scale. The 1 chord has a relative major chord 3 frets up, which is the 3 chord in the scale of A minor. The minor 4 chord has a relative major chord 3 frets up. And, the minor 5 chord has a relative major chord. So, that's 6 of the 7 chords that make up the chords of the scale. True for major and minor scales. The last chord is that pesky diminished chord. Where does that fit? There's going to be an easy trick for this also. For minor scales it's the 2 chord. For major scales it's the 7 chord, which is just before the root. But let's see an easier way to look at this. The major scale has the major 1-4-5 chords and the relative minors that make A 1-4-5 minor pattern 3 frets down. The minor scale has the minor 1-4-5 chords and the relative majors that make A 1-4-5 major pattern 3 frets up. In each scale, the diminished chord is right before the set of major 1-4-5 chords. That's it. It's that simple. The diminished chord is always right before the major 1-4-5 chords in a scale. This is a good time to introduce a trick that new players might miss. Let's say that we want the 1-4-5 chords for D major. That D note is getting pretty high up the low E string. So instead, we'll start on the A string. Okay, that's an A-shaped chord. But, how do we move to the next string to get the 4 and 5 chords? Maybe we've only learned the E and A-shaped bar chords. Here's a simple option. We'll rely on our knowledge of octaves. Instead of going to the 5th fret of the D string, let's go an octave back from there. That's the G note. So, the 4 chord is G major, and the 5 chord is 2 frets up from there. Okay, let's review what we need to memorize for this section. It's not much. Each scale has a 1-4-5 chord progression that we already know from blues. 3 more chords are the relative chords of the 1-4-5. And these chords also make a 1-4-5 pattern. Finally, the diminished chord is just before the major 1-4-5 block of chords. Many people are still confused about the caged system. Let's see if we can make this simpler to understand. We know we can move an E chord up and down the neck with bar chords. And we're already familiar with moving the A chord up and down the neck. We can also move the C chord up and down the neck with bar chords. Let's make this C chord shape easier by dropping the 5th string note. This barred C shape will get us other chords. We can do the same thing with the D chord. Let's just use the first 3 strings. We could theoretically move the G chord up and down the neck, but it's such a stretchy chord that this isn't used much. Instead, we could drop the 5th and 6th strings. Notice that the letter names of those chords that we just moved up and down the neck spells out the word caged. That's why it's called the caged system. Let's now apply this knowledge a little differently. We saw that we can move these chords up and down the neck to get different chords. So, we should be able to get the same chord by using these different shapes. For example, we can play the open C chord. But, we can also get the C chord, using the A chord shape. We just slide the A chord shape up 3 frets and the A chord becomes the C chord. Or, we slide the G chord shape up to A, then B, then C, and we get the C chord again. Or, we use the E chord shape at the 8th fret. Or, slide the D chord shape all the way up to the C chord position. You now know the basics of the caged system. Let's apply this caged system to a simple chord progression, like E, A, and D. Let's play this progression all over the neck, using the caged system. We'll start out with the open chords. As we shift up the neck, we'll use the C shape to get the E chord, the E shape to get the A chord, and the A shape to get the D chord. This can get a bit confusing at first because these chord shapes that we already know become different chords. But let's keep going. Now we'll play the E chord with the A shape, the A chord with the D shape, and the D with the E shape. Naturally, the caged system also applies to the minor chords. A minor, E minor and D minor are the most common shapes. So we can play A minor using the open chord, or the E minor shape, or the D minor shape. That's the basics of the caged system. You can see that it maps the fretboard in terms of common chords. Most people just use the first 3 or 4 strings for these different shapes. You'll want to be able to quickly find these alternate chord shapes, so it takes a bit of practice to burn these into your memory. I don't have any tricks to make this simple to memorize. But, we'll see through the rest of this video, that the caged system is so powerful, that you'll naturally get plenty of opportunities to master it. To make this fun, I like to take different chord progressions and spend 10 minutes finding them all over the neck. Over time these patterns will feel quite foundational. Try these, and then see if you can use them for songs that you already know. Let's try to clear up the basics of modes. It can be really confusing. The terminology is what makes modes confusing. Let's tackle the terminology by looking at an example. I'll number the notes of the A major scale and place them on the low E string. I'm going to include the whole step half-step labeling because this will come in handy later. So, here's the A major scale on one string. What would happen if we made a new scale that used the same 7 notes of this A major scale? But the root was on this second note of the A major scale. Well, the root of this new scale is now B, so it's the key of B. But it's not the B major scale because it doesn't follow the major whole step half-step pattern starting at its B root. It's some other scale of B. In fact, it's one of those modes. Let's not worry about which mode it is yet. What if we started on the third note? That's C sharp. So, Now we have a scale in the key of C sharp, but it's not the C sharp major scale. It's another one of those modes. Now let's do something different. What if we keep A as the root, but shift this A major scale down the neck? Now we still have the key of A, but it's a different scale. It's A in another one of those modes. Okay, we're ready to understand the terminology. If we leave the scale pattern and move the root, then we get a different key and a different mode. Just for fun, let's see the mode names, but, I'll confess, I still don't remember these modes. This would be B Dorian. This would be C sharp Phrygian. This is D Lydian. If we instead keep the same A root, but shift the scale, then we get different modes of A. So, here is A Dorian. This is A Phrygian. This is A Lydian. This is usually what happens when we switch to a different mode in a song. We keep the key, but the scale changes. We switch to a different mode in the same key. You can see from this example that someone might say, just play E major. But, since we'd be emphasizing the A note in our solos, we wouldn't call it E major. It's more accurate to call it A Lydian. There's another aspect of the terminology that we need to address. Let's switch to A minor for this example. If we want to play A Dorian, which is the second mode, we can't just shift this minor scale, which would be like playing G minor. By convention, modes are defined in terms of the major scale. So, in this example, we would have to shift the A major scale to get the A Dorian mode. Dorian mode is the only mode I've been able to memorize, so far. I just remember that if I'm playing key N, then the Dorian mode is key N, -1, and play the major scale around key N, -1. I've listed some YouTube lessons with modes below. See if they make more sense. Let's connect some more dots by looking at how these modes wrap around the neck. We'll use A Phrygian as an example. We'll copy the notes, starting from the third position, to this upper fretboard. Seeing these first 6 notes, we realize that we can use our 2-1-2-1 pattern to fill in the rest of the notes across the fretboard. And we now realize that of course this same pattern will work for any of the modes. For another example of modes, let's review relative major and minor scales. Here's the A major scale. I'm going to make a new key and scale, starting at the 6th note of this A major scale. That's F sharp. So, it's some sort of F sharp scale. Let's shift this down the neck for convenience. Now we'll continue transferring the other A major notes. There. We have the 7 notes of this new F sharp scale. Now I'll wrap this around the neck. We know this scale shape. It's a minor scale. So this is F sharp minor. We didn't change any of the notes. We just changed the order around a new root. So, this is called a relative mode since it's a different key. In this case, since it's the minor mode, we say that F sharp minor is the relative minor of A major. Or, that A major is the relative major of F sharp minor. Notice that F sharp is 3 frets below A. That relationship is very important. The relative minor is always 3 frets below its relative major. The example that we all know is that the relative major of A minor is C major. Now that we understand the terminology of modes a little better, let's see what these modes are doing for us. We know that each scale has a set of major 1-4-5 chords, and the relative minor 1-4-5 chords. So does that mean that some modes are major and some modes are minor? Yes. But, how do we know which modes are major and minor? Let's begin by looking at the F major scale. We know this is a major scale because it has 2 whole steps from the root. That makes a major third from the root, which is what makes it sound major. That means that a mode starting at the 4th note would also sound major. And a mode starting at the 5th note is also going to sound major. So, there are 3 major modes. That means that the other modes are either minor or that weird Locrian mode. We just learned that the relative minor scale is 3 frets down from the major root. So in this example that is D minor. What makes it sound minor is that it has a mixture of a whole step and a half step from the root. Here are the other minor modes, and the Locrian mode. Here's a way to start experimenting with this information without having to know the modes. Let's imagine that we're playing in the A minor scale, and we want to try some other minor modes of A. We just have to put a half step in the first three notes, and follow our 2-1-2-1 pattern. Here's the A minor scale that we know. Here's a different mode of A. And another minor mode on A. This is the A Locrian mode. Of course the same thing works for major scales. Let's imagine the A major scale. Here are the 2 whole steps that start the A major scale. Here's all 7 notes of A major. Here's a different major mode of A. And here's another major mode of A. Okay, let's step back and review what we learned about modes. Modes use the same 2-1-2-1 pattern. The pattern is just rotated around the neck. So there's nothing new to remember there. If we rotate a major scale through the same root, then we get different modes of that root. If we rotate the root through the same major scale, we get different modes in different keys. That gets us to the relative minor and relative major scales. We can make different major or minor modes by starting with major or minor whole half steps. When we're soloing, it's very useful to know where the 1-3-5 notes are in the various chords of the song. Luckily, if we understand one little trick, everything falls nicely into place. Here's the trick. There are only 2 shapes that are used to make the A, C, D, E, F and G chords. G, C and F use one shape, and E, A and D use the other shape. Let's see how this works with the G, C and F chords. Here's the G chord with the 1-3-5 notes labeled. You can see that starting from the low E string, the first 3 notes of the chord are the 1-3-5 notes, in order. Then the next 2 strings repeat the 1-3-5 pattern. But, the high E string is a duplicate of the low E string, so it's another 1 note. The C chord is just the G chord shape, moved up 1 string. Of course the note on the B string had to be moved up because of the G to be tuning. So, the 1-3-5-1-3 pattern is exactly the same, but shifted up a string. The F chord is just the C chord shape, moved up 1 string. Again, the B string note had to be moved up 1 fret. We have the same 1-3-5-1 pattern, but shifted up 1 string. Let's see the E, A and D chords. Here's the E chord. The 1-3-5 notes are shifted up 1 string. So, the pattern starts on the 5 note and then follows the 1-3-5-1 sequence. The A chord is just the E chord shape, moved up 1 string. The B string note is shifted because of the tuning, and we see the familiar A chord shape. Again the sequence is 5-1-3-5. The D chord is just the A chord shape, moved up 1 string. The B string note is shifted because of the tuning, and we see the familiar D chord shape. Again the sequence is 5-1-3. The same patterns and sequence work for the E minor, A minor and D minor chords. The G minor, C minor and F minor chord shapes are not commonly used, but work out the same way. So, let's review what we need to remember. G, C and F chords are the same shape and the sequence is easy. It's 1-3-5-1-3. E, A and D are the same shape but have the 1-3-5 sequence starting with a 5 note. Luckily the minor chords work out the same way. It's time to figure out some tricks to make it easier to use the pentatonic scale all over the neck. In some cases we'll make use of the previous lessons. Let's begin by looking at an easier pentatonic pattern. We'll use A minor for this example. It's a simple pattern that covers a lot of the neck. Let's analyze it. The pattern begins 2 frets below the root on the 6th string. We do a whole step. Move up to the next string and do 2 whole steps. On the next string, do a whole step. Now, we're just repeating the pattern below the next root. 2 whole steps on the next string. On the B string we have to shift up a fret, but the pattern continues. A major uses the same pattern, but has the 2 whole steps starting at the root. Here's both of the scales, side by side. You can see the same pattern in both. We can expand the pattern up the neck by copying the first string back over to the 6th string. When we continue the pattern, we move even further up the neck. And of course, this expansion should make sense, because it's just the major pattern for C, which is the relative major of A minor. Notice where the A roots fall in this pattern. Always at the same position in the pattern. So we can use that to keep track of where all of the roots are. Let's see some other links between these patterns. 3 frets up from a 3-note position is a 2-note position. And 3 frets up from a 2-note position is a 3-note position. Let's shift our focus back to the familiar pentatonic shape. We all know this A minor pentatonic shape. Let's compare this to another A minor pentatonic shape. Let's get rid of string 1 since it's the same as string 6. These are the same pattern, but one is rotated relative to the other. 2 side-by-side strings have 3 fret spacing. The other 3 strings have 2 fret spacing. This is a simple pattern. Let's analyze it. The root has a 3 fret step. That's followed by 3 2-fret steps. In the bottom chart, we have to take the B string shift into account. Then there's another 3 fret step. But if you're like me, we don't want to have to memorize this rotating pattern up and down the neck. Luckily, there is an easy way to link these patterns to something we learned already. We'll apply what we learned about the caged system and the 2 basic chord shapes. Recall that E, A, and D chords all have the same shape. And the equivalent minor chords are the same shape. Let's work with the minor chords first. The low roots of these chords are really easy to find. So, we just have to start our pentatonic shape from the root of these chords. Here it is for E minor. Here it is for A minor. We just move the pattern up 1 string. I'll slow this down for the D minor shape, but you'll see that it's the same pattern. We just have to take the B string into account, and wrap the rules around the neck. That might take a little practice, but not bad. Now, let's use the caged system to move these chords up the neck to get other equivalent chords. This will show us where the pentatonic shape fits in these alternate locations. We'll use the E minor scale for this example. I'll color these different chord shapes so that we don't get confused. Let's now shift these shapes to get the E minor chord in other neck positions. Here's E minor using the D minor shape. So, if we were playing in the E minor scale, we could play this pentatonic shape to stay in E minor. Here's another E minor chord, using the A minor shape. So, we'd play this pentatonic pattern at this fret position. So, we just saw 3 of the 5 pentatonic shapes. But, we now see that it's easier to see these pentatonic shapes tied to the simple chord shapes. We just needed to see where the root of these chords are. And, the caged system lets us see how to use these chord shapes up and down the neck. How about the major chords and the basic pentatonic shape? Well, we already know how to tie the minor pentatonic shape to the major scale, because we know the relative major-minor relationship. So here is A minor and A major. Let's apply this same relationship to the 5 major caged chords. Here are the E, A, and D chords which are the same shape. The root is easy to find in each chord. So, we anchor the pentatonic shape to those roots. And we know where the root is for the G and C chords, so we can use the same anchoring for those chords. When soloing, it sounds nice to go back and forth between the pentatonic scale and the full 7-note scale. We'll use the E minor scale for this example. Here's the E minor chord using the E minor, A minor, and D minor chord shapes. We already learned how the pentatonic shape fits with these chord shapes. Let's see how the full 7-note scale fits in the pentatonic scale. We'll start with the E minor chord shape. I'll use purple to add the additional notes. There. This should look familiar. It's the basic 2-1-2-1 pattern for the minor scale. Do you remember the rules? 2-1 at the root. 2-1 on the next string. 2 on the next. 1-2 on the next. Another 1-2. And back to the 2-1. Let's do the same for the A minor shape. 2-1 starting at the root. 2-1 on the next string. 2 on the next string. The 1-2 gets shifted up for the B string tuning. And we get the second 1-2, which gets repeated on the low E string. Let's do the same for the D minor shape. 2-1 starting at the root. 2-1 on the next string. 2 on the next string gets bumped up for the B string tuning. 1-2 on the next string, which gets repeated on the low E string. The second 1-2 on string 5. I can't instantly visualize these patterns, but at least I now have a relatively simple way to find the pattern. Okay, this was a lot of material. Let's see what we need to memorize. The L-shaped pentatonic pattern is really easy, but we have to remember where it starts for major versus minor scales. Of course, it fits nicely with the relative major-minor relationship. If we remember where the root of each chord is, then we can anchor our basic pentatonic shape to that. Of course, now that we know that there are really just two caged chord shapes, remembering where the root is for each chord is easier. Finally, if we can remember the 2-1 pattern, then we can easily anchor this to the root of the caged chords. This is now the discussion section of the video. You can skip this. I'm just going to ramble a bit about my intention for this video, and any afterthoughts. To begin with, I have to admit that I don't have a good memory. And trying to learn music theory on guitar has been a bit confusing. It's taken me 3 years to get to this point. I've seen lots of great videos on scales modes, the caged system and the pentatonic pattern. I could tell that there was a connection, but I couldn't see it. There's so much terminology, and so many different types of patterns. I instantly break into a nervous sweat whenever a video describes licks in terms of pentatonic positions 1, 2 or 5. But as an engineer, I've learned that if something seems harder than it should be, I'm probably looking at the problem the wrong way. This video is intended to connect the dots between these various patterns that we see, in one video after another. I guess it's my way of thanking these great teachers for all of the tremendous content they have provided, and maybe augmenting their lessons with more detail. If I had had this video 2 years ago, I would have learned so much more quickly. Hopefully this video has connected many of these dots for you. If you're like me, you won't be able to remember all of this after one viewing. But, I'm pretty sure that when you watch other videos now, you'll pick up much more of the content. This should really speed up your learning process. I've put some links below to other videos that you might now find more interesting and useful. Finally, I have no plans to make any more videos. This pretty much exhausts my knowledge. But, if you can tolerate this approach to presenting information, and you have other topics that you think might fit well with this theme of connecting dots, let me know and I'll consider adding to this video, or making additional videos. So, from me and Polly, we're sending best wishes as you improvise your own musical journey.